Hello and welcome to this webinar. Today we'll talk about the Galapagos Islands. This hopefully will help you understand a little bit more about the Galapagos Islands and Ecuador to some extent as a travel destination. My name is Klaus Filsch. I am Ecuadorian. I was a guide in the Galapagos Islands for the longest time, 14 years a guide and expedition leader, and I work in Quito. Still go to the Galapagos Islands several times a year, and I'm a product manager now. The entrance to the Galapagos Islands has to go through Ecuador. There's no other way to get there. I'll expand on that a little bit more, but it's also worth mentioning, although we will have a webinar about the Ecuador as a destination, Ecuador, continental Ecuador. You should also know that it's much more than just the gateway entry and return for the Galapagos Islands. There's a lot more happening here. For one thing, it's right on the equator, as the name may indicate. And there's only 13 countries worldwide that are crossed by the equator, but Ecuador has a few more features that the other 12 countries don't have. And it's worth pointing out that although it is a relatively small country, if you compare it with the other South American countries, you should also know that there are 63 protected areas. In fact, more than 20% of the country is protected by the government. And if you add all the private protected area, it's a little bit over 24%. That's almost 1/4 of the surface of Ecuador is protected. That makes it a very special country, considering how much land is completely protected. It is also one of the most biodiverse countries, so it is definitely worth that we have so much land protected here. And there's a few more things that you probably don't know about Ecuador. It's one of the 5 Amazonian countries. In fact, most of continental Ecuador is the Amazon. It has the Andes. There are 7 countries that are crossed by the Andes. This is the longest mountain range on Earth. It has beautiful beaches, fantastic native markets. The gastronomy is absolutely stunning, and it's very Western friendly if you want. Talk about nature. When you look at birds, South America is a continent of birds with over 3,000 species, and more than half of the South American species of birds are found in Ecuador. In fact, if you look at worldwide of the nearly 10,000 species of birds, Ecuador is number 4. Some books put it as number 5, richest countries on Earth. And before Ecuador, you have countries like Peru or Colombia or Brazil. Well, bear in mind that Brazil is 30 times the size of Ecuador, and Ecuador has almost as many birds as Brazil. In fact, Ecuador, with 280,000 square kilometers, has more species of birds than the entire Amazon with 6 million square kilometers. So it is absolutely amazing. Nature in general, Ecuador is one of the 17 megadiverse countries. This is 70% of the world's species are found on these 17 countries, and Ecuador is by far the smallest of these 17 megadiverse countries. The next one in size is Colombia, and Colombia is 4 times the size of Ecuador. But it's not just nature, it's also culture. It is a very interesting country from that point of view. There are 15 ethnic groups here, 11 languages are spoken. And as I pointed out right at the beginning, it is the one and only country that has the Galapagos Islands. So if you want to put it this way, things that you may be looking for in South America, you can find it right here on this small country, which is your gateway to the Galapagos anyway. A little bit more about Ecuador very briefly. The capital is Quito. It's very close to the Ecuadorian line. The US currency for 22 years has been the US dollars, easy for conversions. If you have any money left after you've been here, it's very easy to give it a good use. The time zone, mainland Ecuador is 5 hours behind Greenwich, and the Galapagos is even 1 hour further away. It's 6 hours UTC, 6 hours behind Greenwich. If you look at the map, and if you're coming from North America or Canada or the US, practically half of the country is within the same time zone as Ecuador, so you shouldn't worry about long flights, as I will point out in a minute, or about jet lags for that matter. More about the country, its area, already pointed out. If you look at continental land, is 256 1,000 square kilometers. It's a very small one. And we have about 17 to almost 18 million inhabitants. It is a democratic government. To get to Ecuador is very simple for most of the countries. No visas are required. All you need is a passport with at least 6 months validity. What does a country live off? Well, its main import or export, sorry, is oil. That is the most important thing. And then we have shrimp. So if you had a fantastic shrimp cocktail, probably came from Ecuador. The best bananas come from Ecuador. And then we have fish, which is also a big export. And then roses. Not only do we export a lot of flowers, but our roses are known to be extraordinarily tall. And this has to do with the fact that we're on the equator and crossed by a mountain range. I mentioned already, Ecuador is an extremely diverse country. No other country in the world has as many species per areas. We're also on the top 5 or top 10 if you're looking at amphibians, if you're looking at reptiles, birds, already mentioned, vascular plants. Number 1 in orchids, currently, and same thing with bromeliad species. So it's extremely, extremely interesting. And no country has as many species per square mile as this country. It's also very accessible. So if you look at this, these are the ship routes. So of course, for cargo or passengers, you can see Ecuador is, well covered with this. If you blow it up to the Galapagos Islands, the only ships allowed in the vicinity or into Galapagos are authorized ships that have a great scrutiny and that take supplies to Galapagos, fuel and supplies. In fact, there is a special port for the Galapagos Islands, and these ships are heavily scrutinized so they do not bring any exotic species to the Galapagos Islands. So these do permanent trips to the islands, bringing the non-perishables, and as I mentioned, fuel to the Galapagos Islands, and they are monitored up on before departure and up on arrival. There's even scuba divers that go and check the hull of the vessel to see that no introduced species could arrive this way. Same thing is with flights. These are the aerial routes worldwide, with this area, of course. And if you look at the Galapagos Islands, if you blow it up, you can see that there are no direct flights to the Galapagos Islands other than mainland Ecuador. Flights originating Quito, stop Guayaquil, and then go to Galapagos Islands. There's daily flights, a couple of airports, and these two are very, very heavily controlled. So there are no cargo flights. Normally, these are passenger flights, and the cargo compartment is also with the perishables required for the people who live in the Galapagos and for the few visitors of Galapagos Islands. Now, even the flights, the aircrafts are screened, disinfected, and there's one last spraying with passengers on board. That's right upon arrival. Right before you arrive in Galapagos, they use permethrin. This is a French product naturally from pyrethroid plants, and it's a fantastic insecticide, and it's approved by the World Health Organization as being innocuous for humans. Upon arrival, you have a few more things, like there's disinfection of your shoes, and then when you arrive to Galapagos, another check of your check-in luggage and your handbags. This is done mainland Ecuador and in the Galapagos Islands one more time, because it's very, very important that we protect the islands from possible introduction of feral and invasive species. So you should know that in the Galapagos Islands, there's actually 3 airlines. There's 5 airports involved in the day you're going to the Galapagos Islands. There's 1,300 kilometers. This is a little bit under 700 miles. Flight to the islands is 1 hour difference, as I mentioned before. So there's a lot of logistical things that you should know about getting to Galapagos, the screening I mentioned. Even though it is a domestic flight, there will be immigration control. So there's some paperwork that needs to be done. Now, when you book through an agency, when you book through an operator with a ship owner, oftentimes all of these procedures are handled for you. And one thing that we always advise is when you go into the Galapagos, as I mentioned, there's 3 airlines, but try not to use your miles to make the flight cheaper, because it's logistically quite challenging with all the things that you can see here. So you could end up in Galapagos at the wrong place, at the wrong airport. I already mentioned the flight originating Quito, and from there they go to 2 different airports, Baltra with GPS, San Cristobal with SCY. A 3rd airport is in San Isabela in Puerto Villamil with IBB. These only serve for flights within the archipelago. So you could be on the wrong island, you could be on the wrong time, on the wrong flight, and when you get there, your ship has left. So considering how complicated Galapagos is and how expensive it is, you shouldn't be using your miles. Make them chubbier at the end of this vacation, but let the local operator handle these things for you. Now, to compare the length of the flight, if you are in Europe, that's about a flight from Rome to Madrid. If you're in the US, that's about a New York-Chicago flight. If you are in Canada, that's like Winnipeg to Calgary. If you're in Japan, then it's about a Tokyo to Seoul. And if you are in Australia, that's about a Sydney-Adelaide flight in terms of distance and times. Now, when you're in the Galapagos Islands, a lot of people are surprised. For one thing, there are a lot of islands. So there's 13 larger ones and 6 smaller ones, so about 19 islands, and then, of course, hundreds of rocks and islets. It's about 8,000 square kilometers of land surface. And if you consider the national park at the moment, at the time of recording this, it's 133,000 square kilometers. That's enormous. And it's about to get bigger next year as it's going to be annexed with the marine reserve of Cocos. So Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador with the Galapagos Islands will have an enormous marine reserve in the North Pacific for the South American region, that is. That's the and in 1535, very quickly, it was discovered by just accidents, and for the longest time, nobody would come to the Galapagos Islands. It was a refuge for the pirates. It was a whaling site, the rich waters, and lots of whales here for a number of years. Whalers would come here and collect whales and process them here. They would stay for up to a year or two in the Galapagos and then continue. 1835, towards the end of the whaling period, Charles Darwin was here. Initially, he was disappointed as he expected something lush and green, and instead he found a completely dry archipelago. But this was part of the inspiration for his book of the Galapagos Island, of the origin of this species. And in terms of species, it's not as biodiverse as mainland Ecuador. So we're talking about over 9,000 species. What is interesting about the Galapagos Islands is that the species you find here, most of them are not found anywhere else in the world. And their behavior is also absolutely amazing and unique if you compare it to other areas. In terms of size, if you're familiar with Hawaii, I just decided to toss in this image. Hopefully you find it useful. Gives an idea. Hawaii is an enormous archipelago with the largest volcanoes on Earth. And this is Galapagos, which is a little bit smaller, but comparably large. Why do you have so many species, and why is it so exciting from one island to the other? It's because it is a group of islands. It's never been connected with the mainland. Occasionally during ice ages, some of the islands may have been linked as the level of the sea may have dropped. And what you can see there in light blue is the Galapagos plateaus. Some islands may have been connected with each other, but never with the mainland. So the species had to arrive here by sea or by air. So that means very few species could make it. So it's a very different ecosystem here as in mainland Ecuador. And because of the altitudinal ranges, this is also something that provides a lot of ecosystem. So the few species here had to be able to branch into several species. It's called adaptive radiation. Few places on Earth you can see it as clearly and as evident as you can do in the Galapagos. Hence that name, the Laboratory of Evolution. And as you can see from the little white areas on this map, this is 3% of Galapagos, where you have about 33,000 inhabitants. There's Galapagueños, they live on these 4 islands. The rest, everything that's in color on land, you have 0 inhabitants. And that's the enormous national park. 97% of the land surface is protected. Now, when you come into Galapagos, it's not like one island is like the other. We have produced a few themes that we thought were interesting. And when you come to the islands and you want to be in a combination of these different themes. For one, the central and northern islands, it's very interesting because here you can clearly see that this harmony that I mentioned with mainland Ecuador. So it's like you have the type island, and you can compare it with the other, and that type island is Genovesa. It's one of the most amazing islands in Galapagos. You can only reach it if you swim there or if you fly there. So the terrestrial fauna is disharmonial with the rest of Galapagos, while Galapagos is disharmonial with mainland Ecuador. This is something that the guides and expedition leaders in Galapagos can expand, and this is fascinating about the Galapagos Islands. Now, when you go into the western part, especially to the left shore, the west shore of Isabela, much more than the southern or the eastern shores, you would be in the richest waters of Galapagos and simultaneously in the youngest volcanoes of Galapagos. These are also the loftiest mountains with up to more than 1,700 meters above sea level, with a drop below sea level of another 3,000 meters. So you can understand, like Hawaii, these are enormous volcanoes, and they're very young and they're active at this time. So you have the richest waters there, so good chances of spotting whales here, and the area where the flightless marine fowl are, penguins and flightless cormorants. And then you get to this lower southeastern part of Galapagos, where these four islands especially are perhaps genetically the most isolated islands, because the prevailing winds and currents go to the northwest. So if something gets into the water, it could be carried to the central islands, but never in the other direction. So for instance, here you have each of these islands has one species of mockingbird, one species of land lava lizard, one species of Fe Iguana, and so on. So it's extraordinarily interesting and genetically isolated for that reason. So as you can see, these segment of islands have a theme, and our itineraries want to have a combination of them. Although we call the Northern Islands, it has a combination of these islands, and that's what makes a trip to the Galapagos exciting. So when you're thinking about how to get to the Galapagos Islands, there's basically, you have hotels in Galapagos, and in there, as you can imagine, in the 3% of Galapagos that is not national park, that's within those four islands that are inhabited a few slides ago. Now, there's a total of over 7,700 beds available for tourists in Galapagos in that 3% that's not national park. That's hotels and Airbnbs, which in Galapagos are almost considered a hotel for statistical reasons. But you also have island hopping, and island hopping generally means you're going from one of the inhabited islands to the other. Now, bear in mind that there is a bit of a distance of open water from one of them to the other. That's about 87 kilometers of open water at 90 degrees of the prevailing winds and currents. So these could be extremely choppy at times. And the fast boats that take these 87 kilometers in something like under 3 hours, between 2 to 3 hours, can be a little bit challenging for your backbone. As you can see, the seats are facing each other. So with the boats jumping from one crest to the other, this can be a little bit, in fact, it is, let's be honest, it's not the nicest part of your vacation, Galapagos. And you're going from one inhabited island to the other, you're basically staying within the 3% that's not a national park. And then the next way you have to go to the Galapagos is by boat. There's a total of 69 vessels, yachts, sailboats in the Galapagos Islands that are licensed to stay there and do trips in the Galapagos. These are very small vessels. They range between 10 and 100 passengers, and it's extremely limited too, because the 69 vessels together have 1,690 beds. Think about how many ships are out there in the rest of the world that have 1,690 cabins, right? With at least double that capacity, and those are considered not even large vessels. So it's extremely limited. So in some of the seasons, you might not find spaces there, so try to book ahead of time. Now, back to the hotels. While hotels alone may just keep you on a very small part of the 3% that's not national park, there are a few hotels that have yachts. There's only 12 small yachts that have the permit for day tours, and their combined capacity is 200 guests. So at any given moment, out of those 7,700 beds on the hotels up here in the left of the slide, from this number, only 200 guests could have access into the national park, into 4 of the big areas of the fantastic places where you can collect a lot of the highlights of Galapagos without staying on the boat. That is a possibility when you're going there. So a little bit about the vessels. I already mentioned large vessels are not even allowed into the marine reserve. So hundreds of miles away from the core of the Galapagos National Park is where ships can sail. They cannot even cross the marine reserve, whether these are cargo ships, fishing vessels, or passenger boats. Now, when you hear about large vessels, these are large vessels on the top of the slide. And in the Galapagos, the largest vessel you would have is about 75 meters in length. The largest ship is 100 passengers. That's about 40 or 50 cabins. That's very, very limited. So you can imagine small vessels altogether in Galapagos. And these are subdivided by expedition yachts, when anywhere between 16 to 24 cabins, or single guided boats that have anywhere between 6 and maybe 10 cabins. They're much smaller. So that's the lower part of this slide is what is available in Galapagos, right? 51 single-guided vessels, and then you have 18 multi-guided vessels. We don't think that's splitting vessels by the size, by how many meters they have, makes more sense for your when you decide to choose for your vacation in Galapagos. But how many guides do you have? If you have one guide on board of your boat, or if you have more than one guide, and that's those 18 multi-guided vessels. So basically, few of the 69 vessels, which is already a small number, is possibly better than the single-guided vessels. Let me expand a little bit on that. First thing, size. Of course, size could be an issue when you're going on a boat in the Galapagos. Think about how much more space do I have? Where can I go on my vessel aside of my cabin? And there's something called the passenger space ratio. So when you're in the Galapagos, or when you're planning to Galapagos, ask about the passenger space ratio of the vessels you may be interested in. And you never want to be on something that is less than 25. When you're on below 20, that means that if your cabin is reasonably large, that means for the rest of the vessel, they will be very, very narrow. There's very few public areas you can be. And if you don't get along with the other 15 guests or 14 guests if you're in a couple, then you might find this an issue that you don't have a space to enjoy on your own. So these are very few places. Most of the vessels in Galapagos are between 10, less than 10, or slightly above 10 when you look at the passenger space ratio. Again, anything below 20 is definitely going to be an issue. Want to look something that is above 25. Now, the thing about having one guide or having more than one guide is that the national park allows you to have 16 guests per guide. Now, generally, when you have a multiple guided vessels, the groups tend to be smaller, and they tend to be also divided by something that makes more sense. While the single guided vessels will have 16 guests or less, will have only one guide. That means that the 16, and they'll try to get to the 16 to make it profitable. It will be just one guide for everyone, and you have to do what the guide is doing. Now, this may ramify or branch off into other issues like language. If you speak English and you're getting on board of the vessel, and what if last minute somebody bought a family from South America, then the guide will have to speak 2 languages, and maybe there's a European family that's also there. And if the guide speaks all those languages, everybody's entitled to have the explanations in one language, in their language. So you would have the guide speaking 2 or sometimes 3 languages. And of course, you will get a lot less information. And believe me, I was a guide in the Galapagos for the longest time. I had to lead groups sometimes in 2 or 3 languages, and it's difficult for the guide, and it's definitely difficult for the group. So in a multiple guided vessel, we will separate the groups by language, so that we'll never have 2 languages. You'll ever hear everything you will hear in your language. That includes the lectures on board, and that will include also the safety issues about the vessel, like, for instance, the boat drill exercise talk, which is a briefing about safety in case of an emergency of a vessel. Then having more than one guide will also mean that you can have more than one option that you can do simultaneously. Let's say that after the walk, you don't want to go snorkeling, you don't know how to snorkel, you don't want to snorkel, or you just can't because you just had knee surgery. Well, while everybody's snorkeling, you can't just go back to the trail and look at the animal colonies. You'll have to go back on board or just sit on the beach because you cannot be without a guide. So snorkelers will be with a guide. But if you have other options like kayaking, paddleboarding, some very few vessels have paddleboarding, or glass bottom boat, which from the 69, only 6 vessels have that feature, then you would have to stay on board while the guide is doing the other option. So having multiple guides means that we can have these options at simultaneously, and you can choose which one's best. You can even combine 2 of them. You can go snorkeling, but also combine this with a glass bottom boat ride. So you can have a guide that tells you the name of the fish that you saw while you were snorkeling, and also explaining why they're called that way. On a single guided vessel, you can only do one of these activities at a time because there's only one guide on board. And then a very important aspect is a medical doctor. Having an infirmary or a medical doctor, bear in mind that Galapagos is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And as you remember from one of the previous slides, the areas where you have the towns, the little spots that are inhabited, the 3% of Galapagos that is inhabited, where you have 2 hospitals and they're not that well equipped for certain things. You would have to fly to mainland Ecuador if it's a more complicated issue. But not having a medical doctor or an infirmary on board can be a very big issue if you have an emergency in remote locations. If you're in Fernandina, one of the most stunning places in Galapagos, it's 132 nautical miles from the hospital in Galapagos, or 127 miles from the airport, where you can have an air ambulance fly you back to the mainland. So if you don't have a medical doctor, and the guide and the captain will, without knowing what to do, will probably interrupt the trip and then sail probably 15 or 16 hours to get to Puerto Llora or to Baltra at the airport. And then it could be just a minor thing, but the trip is interrupted and you cannot go back where you left the trip. You will have to catch up wherever it is. So a couple of sites, a couple of days may be lost in that period. Now, very few ships have medical doctor. In fact, from the 69 vessels, 60 don't have a medical doctor, and they just rely on hopefully no emergency may come up. So that's something that's very important. In our vessels, all of them have a medical doctor and an infirmary. If you want to learn more about choosing your right trip to the Galapagos Islands, on the link above, or if you Google the Choose Wisely Galapagos, you'll find, and you can download the ebook. You can find this very useful because we have 15 points to point out on what you should consider when you're going to the Galapagos, and that may help make a decision on how to choose better, whether it's a ship, whether it's a hotel, whether it's a single guided vessel or multiple guided vessel. If you're worried about going to the Galapagos and think that maybe going to the Galapagos may contribute to damage because Galapagos has over-tourism or something, you should also know that the Galapagos National Park, created on the 4th of July, 1959, is also the birthplace, if you want, of sustainable tourism. Now, the story of Galapagos and conservation is extraordinary. Come to the Galapagos and we can expand all about it, but just very briefly about it, it's from there until now, tourism has helped protect the Galapagos Islands. And from 1959 until now, the Galapagos are in a much better shape. Even the people who live there went from being an issue about the Galapagos to being part of the solution today. And this is very important, you should know. Why going to islands in first place? This is interesting. I took this from the Galapagos Conservation Trust and the Island Conservation. 5.3 of the Earth's surface is islands, right? So it's a very small portion, yet 19% of the avian biodiversity is on islands. 75% of birds, amphibian, mammals, and reptile extinctions have happened on these islands. It's only 5.3% of the surface, yet 75% of these extinctions have happened on islands. 41% of all the critically endangered terrestrial vertebrates are on islands, and 86% of the recorded extinctions by invasive species have happened on islands. So islands are very, very critical. And tourism in Galapagos has helped us protect it and preserve it. Now, 1959, the national park was created, and that was also the year the Charles Darwin Foundation started, and then the Charles Darwin Research Station on the heart of Galapagos on Santa Cruz Island on Puerto Llora. There's 3 columns of all the projects that are being run in Galapagos. One of them is about areas that have never been touched, and we want to keep them on that pristine condition. So that's one of the highlights, one of the priorities. The second priority is all the areas that have had some sort of humanly caused damage because of the introduction of rats, cats, dogs, goats, pigs, cattle, etc. Those places is to bring it back to its initial state. That's a great part of Galapagos. And then the 3% of Galapagos where you have people living long before the national park was created, those areas need to be also monitored and protected, so that the fact that people are living there, as I said before, are not a damage for the national park, not a risk, but an important part of the solution of Galapagos. So there's a number of projects that are being run by the Charles Darwin Foundation. You look at their webpage, and you can become a member and a donor if you want, and you learn more about their projects when you come on board of our vessels. A few things I want to highlight, for instance, the island of Floriana. That's a very interesting project where we want to bring back the things to where they once were, like one of the rarest birds, the Floriana mockingbird. The vermilion flycatcher is extinct on one island, it's virtually extinct on the other. In one island, they have a few dozen nests, and each nest is being catered individually. And then the rarest bird, one of the rarest birds in the world probably, which is the mangrove finch, one of the Darwin finches, where each individual nest is catered in only one little cove of the island of Isabela. And nest by nest, individual by individual, they're managing to bring slowly this species out of the most critically endangered list to hopefully a more promising future. Now, talking about mass tourism in Galapagos, if that's what worries you, you should know that there is no mass tourism in the Galapagos Islands. 2018 is the year we had the largest numbers. That was 276,000 people went from mainland Ecuador into the Galapagos Islands that were not Galapagos residents. And about 1/3 of that, or 75,000 visitors, went into the national park. Remember, that's 97% of Galapagos. That's 75,000 visitors in 1 year. So you should know that in Galapagos, that's not a large number. If you want to compare that with other places on Earth, here's a few examples. This is the area of the Galapagos Islands, 133,000 square kilometers. I already mentioned 2018. That's the largest number we've ever had. 2019, it was a little bit over 271,000 visitors, so it dropped slightly from the year before. Let's compare that year with a few other places. Let's compare it with Yosemite National Park in California. And even though you can see that in 2016, you had over 5 million visitors in that year, 2018, the one we want to compare with, you had 4 million visitors, right? And let's look at Venice in Europe. In 2018, there were over 5 million visitors in an area that is remarkably small. So if you compare the size of Galapagos, compare the size of Venice or the Yosemite National Park, and the number of visitors, you can see that Galapagos is definitely not mass tourism. Bear in mind another fact. By the pictures on the right, you can see the summer in one place and the winter in the other. And of course, the summer in Yosemite or the summer in Venice is where most of the visitors go, where in the winter very few people go. So the number you're looking at is also concentrated in just a few months, versus Galapagos, where you have very a few changes in the year, there's only a little climate change, the hours of the day remain the same. And this brings me to the next moment. When is the best time to travel to the Galapagos Islands? And now you should know that Galapagos is on the equator, just like Ecuador. So here you should be at what's called the intertropical convergence zone, which is right there on the equator. The British sailors called this the doldrums, and they fear to sail it because this is an area where you virtually have no wind. Now you have those trade wind areas just north of it and just south of it. But the ocean is a bit of a dynamic place, so the intertropical convergence zone is not right on the equator. If you take the northern summer, it is blown up to right over Panama Canal, so it goes well over it. And then if you're going on your northern winter, you can see that the intertropical convergence zone drops down to virtually Galapagos. That's when for January, February, and March, you have practically no wind on the Galapagos Islands versus the rest of the year. We do have some wind, considering you're right on the doldrum zone where you would expect it to be. Now, the weather in the Galapagos and the wildlife of Galapagos are influenced by wind currents and ocean currents, and this is the currents that brought life into the Galapagos Islands, and they also bring either warm water for a few months or cold water for most of the year. And as you can see on this arrow here, the cold water current, the Humboldt current, comes from the Antarctic region. It goes right in front of the coast of most of Chile and all of Peru, and right where the border of Peru and Ecuador is, it is pushed to the left, is pushed to the west by the Coriolis effect. Similar thing happens with a warm water current that most of the year is not influencing Galapagos until you have the northern winter, when that warm water, Central American water, comes right into the Galapagos and floods all of the archipelago. There's a third current, also cold water. So from the three main currents that come to Galapagos, two are cold, which is why most of the year Galapagos waters are cold, considering we're right on the equator. And this current is called Cromwell, and it's slowly moving to the east. And it's the current that has made the western part of Galapagos that extraordinarily rich part of ocean Galapagos. Now, when you look at the, so this is the ocean currents that affect the climate, as in warm water or most of the year with cold water. But then the length of the day. Maybe it's exaggerated, but here's Oslo for comparison. And you can see that in the center of this slide, you can see that at the bottom is the beginning of the day. Then as you move up to the red line, that's midday. And as you get to the top of this image, you have the evening and the night. So you can see here on the left that the days are extraordinarily short. In December, the shortest day of the year. And then towards the summer, right by June, you have the longest day of the year. And this is how you have 4 seasons in Oslo, in New York, in Seattle, in Argentina and Buenos Aires, maybe. Now, here's Ecuador, and here's the Galapagos Islands. This is Quito or Galapagos Islands. As you can see, it doesn't matter if you come in January, February, March, April. It doesn't matter when you come. The days are virtually starting at the same time and ending at the same time. So we have 12 hours of daytime, 12 hours of nighttime, rising at the same time, setting at the same time. It's very boring if you live here like me, but it's extremely good when you don't know when is the best time to come to the Galapagos. Choose a month and you can come here. There's a little slight change in climate. It's never too cold or too warm, as you can see on this chart right here. January, February, March are the warmer months. July, August, September, and October, as I mentioned, it's a little bit longer, is the cooler time of the year, but it's never extraordinarily cold. It's never extraordinarily cold, warm in the Galapagos. And this is for the air temperature and for the ocean temperature. On the cooler time of the year, you should also benefit that the ships have wetsuits on board. So when do you want to come to the Galapagos? Any time of the islands. And no matter if you're coming on the drier time or cooler time, or you're coming in the warmer or rainier time of the year, there's always activities, the same activities you can do, and it's fantastic. And in terms of wildlife, you don't miss out on anything. Look at this chart here. This is the island of Rábida. And may I point out another thing? As you can see, the warmer months, the transition month, and the cooler months in blue. May I also point out the fact none of the guests here is wearing parkas and scarves for the cooler time of the year. And notice also another thing, our vessels are virtually always alone. All of our visitor sites. So from now on, when you're looking at our pictures and you see the ship in the background, you will see that we're on our own. What should you pack and how should you prepare for a trip to the Galapagos Islands, considering this climate changes? On that link right there, you can download the packing list, and there's some things that you must have and some things that we suggest you to have, and some things that you can even buy them here on the ship. So that's another possibility. So I advise you to look at that webpage right there. So the best time to come to the Galapagos is, as I pointed out earlier, when you have time to come to the Galapagos Islands. There's not a month that you should avoid to come here. There's not a month that you have to come here. So you can also imagine that those 70 to 70,000 people, visitors that come to the Galapagos Islands, it doesn't matter when they come because they would never miss out. So spread out on 12 months of the year, not on a tiny window like on my example of Yosemite or Venice. When you come to the Galapagos Islands and your high priority is wildlife, then look at this list. This is the big 15. Just like in Africa, you have the big 5 that you must take off and try to take off all of them, right? Next trip, the ones you haven't been able to take out on the previous trip and so on. In Galapagos, it was impossible to make a list of 5 because they're so fantastic. They're so amazing. And how do you get to be on that list? This is based on the guiding and the guidees. How much can a guide talk about a given species, and how much is the average person willing to listen still before it starts to get tedious, too scientific for your interest? It gets boring, let's put it that way. So with that criteria, we made a survey of all of the Galapagos species, and we picked the first 15, and they're here on alphabetical order. And this is how exciting they are to talk about for the guides and to listen for the average non-scientific guest. So with that list in mind, keep look at this. Some of the islands, the name givers. Some trips and the Galapagos will never show you this, and this is very sad because this is the name giver, of course. Galapagos. There's several species on Galapagos. Some are extinct, and they're very hard to see because, as you can see here, they tend to be on the higher parts of the islands where there's more vegetation. And of course, the visits, the 183 visiting sites in Galapagos, most of them are in the lower part of the islands, very close to the coast. So for most of the time, when you see the giant tortoises, it's on the islands that are inhabited where there's a road that can take you up to where the tortoises are found. Penguins. Now, there are penguins in other places in the southern hemisphere, but this is the only penguin that is, as you can see up here, also in the northern hemisphere permanently. There are nobody, no tourist goes to this end over here. Most of them go here, and then on Floriana and Santiago Island by Bartolome, where you may see the penguins also. That's it. So if you want to see penguins in Galapagos on your trip and you want to swim with them, then make sure you have an itinerary that includes the penguins, right? This is one of the big 15s. There are 2 pinnipeds. There's the Galapagos sea lion, and then there's the Galapagos fur seal. Now, the fur seals have been clubbed to almost extinction during that whaling period, especially in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Almost to extinction. And although their numbers have come back to a much safer one today, their distribution tend to be in areas where very few people go. There's no visiting site in many of these places. So only very few places have the fur seals. And make sure that when you go to the Galapagos, you have this amazing sea lion. You have the sea lions and the fur seals. One came from the northern hemisphere. The other one came from the southern hemisphere, brought here, as you know now, by the Coriolis system that brings the currents from mainland America to the Galapagos Islands. This is the smallest pinniped on Earth. So here you have these long lost cousins in Galapagos, so try to get both of them. I'll give you another example of a big 15. It's the fur seal the iguana in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe iguana. And as you can imagine by the name, this lizard is only and exclusively found on Santa Fe. It's an enormous iguana, and it's only found on one island in the world. That's the little island of Santa Fe. So with that big 15, you look at the distribution of the wildlife, you can look at the itinerary and see how many of them are covered. If you have any specific that you must see, then of course try to pick one that has that one. The itineraries that we have are itineraries that are designed to yield the highest number of big 15s in the time that we go to the Galapagos Islands. We've been doing trips in the Galapagos Islands since 1969. We've been also looking at over the years, what's the ideal length of an itinerary? Back when I started guiding in the 80s, in Galapagos, you still had 3-week charters, group that would spend 3 weeks in Galapagos. That, of course, is no longer happening. Most people come to Galapagos and want to spend some time in mainland Ecuador, or may even stretch it a little bit more with Colombia or with Peru, which are also very compatible. So the length of time tends to be reduced, but you don't want to chop the exposure of the most critical Galapagos wildlife. So make sure that you have 11 or 12 big 15s if it's less than a week's time. In our trips, the 6-night, 7-day trips have more than the 4-night, 5-day trips, because if you pay more, you should also get more. So these itineraries may sail a little bit more than the other ships. We also carbon neutral, you should know. But that way, you could also have not miss out on the Galapagos wildlife if you're only coming once in your life to the Galapagos Islands. So you would have more concentrated exposure to wildlife in the time that makes sense to go to the islands. Here you can see the complete exposure of the wildlife, and a few species like the red-footed boobies that are only found up here and so on. So if I go back to what I have a few slides ago, if wildlife is important to you, and remember there were 3 ways to see the Galapagos Islands. Let's not talk about just going to one hotel and stay there within a fraction of the 3% of Galapagos. So let's not talk about that. Let's start with the next level, which is island hopping. You spend some time in one of the towns on one of the islands, and then you take a boat or whatever means to the other island, and then you stay in a hotel in a different island. So what is covered here in blue is basically what you would have of Galapagos, and you would have anywhere between 9 and, if you're lucky, 11 big 15s. But that means that many of them will be out of a town. For instance, you'll see the sea lions in the Fisher Market. You would see the frigates as they fly over the town. You will see the blue-footed boobies as you're crossing the ocean. You don't see them in their colony as you're walking in midst of the nesting animals, or the rookeries of the sea lions and fur seals. So you would miss out on a number of them. And the few that you have are not really in a natural enclosure. This is like flying all the way to Botswana and seeing a few zebras on the park across the street of your hotel if you're staying in the capital. Doesn't make sense. The other one, remember, was staying in a hotel that has its own yacht or has a yacht access, and there were only 200 people that could do it at any given moment out of the 7,700 beds available on the 4 islands with the 130 some hotels or Airbnbs. So this is your exposure. This is not a bad one. This is staying in a hotel. You have one day trip per day. So you're going out to Santa Fe, you're going to North Seymour, to South Plaza. Sorry, this is on the central area here, or you're going to Bartolome. Here, look at this. You have an exposure to penguins. Here you have fur seals. You have Galapagos hawks. So you can actually tick off within this range 12, that's 80%, 12 of the big 15s, but it's one site per day. The best way to see, of course, if wildlife is important to you, it's a little bit more expensive, is to go by cruise, by an expedition cruise, and then you have virtually all of the Galapagos National Park, and then you will have exposure to places like Punta Suarez or Genovesa. Remember Genovesa, I mentioned this as the type island because it's great to compare with the rest of Galapagos, and that's one of the 2 places you can have the rarest, the least seen, let's put it this way, booby of the 3 species, but also the most numerous, as Genovesa has the largest colony in the world. Española, only one tip of this island, you can see the Galapagos albatross. And this is the only albatross that breeds in the tropics, and it's the largest bird in the East Pacific. So it's definitely a fantastic bird to see. There's a lot of legends and myths about it, and it's really amazing that you can be at this close range on a bird that completely ignores you and continues whatever it's doing, if it's doing its courtship or nesting or whatever it is doing. The flightless cormorant, this is a fantastic bird. It's one of the big 15s for good reason. It's only found here in the rich area here. Remember in one of my early slides, I mentioned this area is fantastic because it has the richest waters. So it makes sense for the penguins and flightless cormorants to be here because you don't have to fly to richer feeding grounds if the feeding grounds in front of you are always rich year round. So it's the only place, and very few ships go there. And of course, no day trip could go all the way over here. Few ships come here because it's a long sail to come here. This is where I said from Fernandina to Isabela, you may have also Santa Cruz, you may have 15 or 16 hours sail to get there. And it's the largest cormorant in the world. And because it's flightless, look at those tiny, almost sad-looking wings, and it seems to be covered with fur, like a kiwi, because of course fur is a lot more efficient in the water as it would be in the air because the bird doesn't fly. The feathers now look like fur. And then you have those things that are not scheduled, and this is important for us because you can never guarantee certain things with those big 15s. We feel very confident with some of them, less confident with the others. But then you have whales and dolphins in Galapagos. Galapagos is a whale sanctuary with 26 species of cetaceans here. We never know when to find them. There's year-round whales like orcas and sperm whales and blue whales and bridie or tropical whales and so on. And there's only one species that is seasonal, which is the humpbacks that come from the southern seas and in the cooler time of the year to calve in the Galapagos Islands. So year-round you can see these. But for us, when we see whales, we announce them and we try to show them to you, whether this is by boat or this is by the ship approaching them. There's protocols that we need to follow, of course, and so on. We also keep track on the wildlife of Galapagos. Luckily, there's not a time of the year when you should go because all the birds are breeding. Because, as you remember, the days are 12 hours long. There's not a difference of the length of the day throughout the year. So for the species, there's something called the opportunistic breeding or tropical breeding. They would breed when the conditions are appropriate for them. And for most of them, this could be any time of the year. There's very few that seem to have a predictable or a 12-month pattern. For most of them, it's a couple of times of the year or more than 1 year, like the red-footed boobies. And this could start any time of the year. So always when you go to Galapagos, there's so many exciting things happening, and the stages of the reproductive processes are all present for all the year. When it's giving birth of sea lions, there's a bit of a pattern, but it's a very stretched, long period. So any month you go to Galapagos, you will find plenty of the young, playful ones, and they stay longer with the mothers. So it's really exciting whenever you go to Galapagos to be with the sea lions. These are smaller than the Californian ones, but close cousins, recently raised to a new species. So swimming with them or just enjoying them on land if you're not going to be snorkeling is year round. And then penguins. When you're going to the Antarctic, there's certain times of the year that you would see the penguins, but you wouldn't see the other species. Here you can see the penguins year round. This is one of the smallest penguins of the world. This is the northernmost penguin in the planet, and the only place on Isabela where it's also permanently found on the northern hemisphere. And it is an adorable little bird. Although we have to keep a distance to them, they will very, very often, especially when they're in the water, come right up to your mask and see its reflection and glaze at itself as it's reflected on your mask. This is a fantastic thing. Remember, we're not allowed to touch the wildlife. Snorkeling in Galapagos is fantastic, and it's fantastic any time of the year. Also, in the warmer time of the year, you will probably not need a wetsuit. We do suggest wetsuits and for most of the year because it will give you sun protection. It gives you also some buoyancy, and we believe everyone in a wetsuit looks very good. So go ahead and take your wetsuit any time of the year. We have them on board of our vessels. These are Shorties 2 millimeters available for our guests. And as you can see here, there's a ladder for the advanced snorkeling, and you can get in and out of the Zodiac. We do a little briefing on safety for all of these things, and getting in and out of the Zodiac is also very easy, and tons of things to see. And now, as I pointed out, when you look at the pictures of our trips, you can always see one of our vessels out there on their own, no other vessels. We basically own this site. And if you're going on small vessels, single guided, you will often have a different scenario. As you can see here, there is already 6 boats right there on this same spot as over here. So that's something that means that you will have to share the place, that you may have a group in front of you that's slowing you down, or a group behind you that is sort of speeding you up at the pace you would much rather go, which means that at midday when you're going to snorkeling, they will find a lot of other snorkelers in that place. As we own the place practically on our itineraries, our expedition leaders can be a lot more efficient in terms of breaking down the groups, as I mentioned, one language only, but also perhaps by interest, so that the snorkelers could spend more time snorkeling but not miss out on the walk as they walk on a lighter pace. But the non-snorkelers could enjoy a lot more the trail because they're not going to snorkel. They don't need to be rushed. And we can do that because we can split up our guests, the entirety of our guests, into several groups that make a lot more sense. Who's Galapagos ideal for? Well, solos, couples, families. We suggest 6 years and up, and this is because we've been doing these trips since 1969. Hardly anyone, Lindblad's the only company that has as much experience as we do in the Galapagos Islands. And it's fantastic for multi-generation travelers, not only on board, but on the islands too. And we try to have, although we're too small, our ships, for kids clubs or something like that. We adults, parents must be responsible for their kids or grandkids, but we have activities on board for them. At one point, when there's a lecture about Darwin, there may be activities for young explorers. Also, the meals may be served a little bit earlier if the parents request this. We are always happy to do that. And then, of course, the terrain is a bit more challenging. So as you can see on the previous picture of this one, it's unfortunately not a destination for wheelchairs. But if you can walk 1 mile in the morning, and if you can walk 1 mile in the afternoon with all the interruptions, because we don't rush the mile, we walk a few yards and then we stop. It's about 1.5 kilometers, by the way, if you're metric. Then you're all right. Bring good walking shoes. We have walking sticks on board. So if you just had surgery on your calf, on your knee or something, and you're worried about walking Galapagos, it's about 1 mile. A few are longer than that, and a few are shorter, but the average is about 1 mile. And then, of course, you have all these other things that, so if you have families that are different interests and different levels and different abilities and limitations, there's a glass bottom boat, while some more, the more active ones want to do the paddle boarding. Sort of intermediate activity is the kayaking or snorkeling, right? So in our ships, we have all of the activities that are approved by the national park. We can do, and because we have many guides, we can have all of them simultaneously. So just to end, when I was still a guide and when I was an expedition leader, 14 years in the Galapagos Islands, there was one thing that I always remember, and there was one guest that while I was leading the group and talking about the wildlife, and he was photographing next to me, he looked back at me, he said, being in Galapagos is like being inside a nature documentary. And this is true, because there's no other place on earth where you're so close to the Galapagos wildlife that we need to ask you to step back, because you need to be 6 feet, 2 meters away from the wildlife. But the wildlife sometimes comes right up to you, and you're looking at the wildlife that is completely ignoring you, while the naturalist is explaining you about these fantastic animals. sometimes so close that you can actually look at the pattern, and we'll explain you what color are the feet of the blue-footed boobies. I'll leave you that for when you come to the Galapagos Islands. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has helped, and I hope to see you sometime soon. Thank you very much.